You know, I can recall with amazing clarity the few times over my pastoral career when I've been so sick that I've had to miss church. And one such time was Palm Sunday about 10 years ago. It reminds me of the little boy who had to stay home on Palm Sunday from church sick with his mom, but his dad took the rest of the clan and then brought the son home this palm branch. "Why do we have palm branches on Palm Sunday?" the boy asked. "Well, you see," the dad explained, when Jesus rode into town, everyone waved palm branches to honor him. So we all got palm branches in the worship service today. To which the little boy replied, "Ah, shucks. The one Sunday I miss is the Sunday that Jesus shows up." Well, I'm confident that Jesus will show up today, even though maybe we will not worship him with quite the fervor of that first Palm Sunday. You know, someone has compared the reception that Jesus received on that Palm Sunday to that of a ticker tape parade in New York City. Some of us who are a bit longer in the tooth, we might remember ticker tape. Of course, ticker tape is a long, narrow strand of paper with these holes punched in them, and these strands of paper would often carry information about the performance of the New York Stock Exchange. It seems back in the day, as the data was being entered by machines, holes would be punched in the tape as it fed through, and then some other machines would kind of interpret the information for the brokers. It was sort of like an early computer, some pretty high-tech stuff for its day. And yet, there was a problem. What are you going to do with all of this darn stuff once you're done with it? Tons and tons of this useless paper. And let's recall, folks, that this was long before the days of recycling. So some enterprising individual gets the bright idea of staging a parade for some hero and dumping the whole mess out the window. And over time, the greatest honor that New York City could bestow on someone was to throw them a ticker tape parade. Hey, I'll bet you didn't know that since the first such parade back in 1886, the 204 parades have taken place. I mean, just imagine the tons of paper that descended upon the heads of American heroes. Let's take 1951, when 3,250 tons of paper showered down on General Douglas MacArthur as his motorcade wended its way through Manhattan. Or the 3,425 tons drifting down on the first astronaut to orbit the Earth, Ohio's own John Glenn, in 1962. And by the late 60s, the New York Stock Exchange upgraded to electronic boards, leaving them with little use for ticker tape. So some other enterprising office workers resorted to shredding old computer paper and throwing it out the window. But somehow it just didn't have quite the same effect. And then somebody else, they got tired of tearing pages out of the New York City phone book. So instead, they just sort of chucked the whole thing out the window, clunk. And it ended up striking a parade onlooker on top of the noggin and knocking them senseless. And maybe that's why ticker tape parades are a bit less common these days. Besides the way they build skyscrapers nowadays, how would you even get the darn windows open to begin with? Nevertheless, for a few moments, on a much smaller scale, let's imagine the exhilaration this morning of a ticker tape parade in Jerusalem in about 30 AD. Imagine the excitement surrounding this occasion because Jesus, he's coming to town. And every little boy, whether he's sick or whether he's well, would want to be there and get his palm branch. Because some say this Jesus guy is a great teacher, while others say he's a great healer, and others that he's the Messiah. Yeah. In our own mind's eye, let's visualize that scene, and let's let our ears be filled with the noise of the crowd as they shout, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And dear ones, in the days to come during this Holy Week, our minds are going to become all filled with lots of somber and disturbing images, and to a certain degree, yeah, that's important. It's necessary that we journey with Jesus to the cross this week. After all, we just can't skip over Holy Week and move right from the pomp and circumstance of Palm Sunday to Easter. Yeah, it's like the guy I saw at a big Promise Keepers gathering in D.C. about 20 years ago. It was called the Million Man March. And there was this kooky-looking fellow we kept seeing dragging around this cross on his shoulders. But you might say, "Oh, okay, preacher, but doesn't Jesus call us to, pick up our crosses and follow?" Yeah, he does. But I don't know if he calls us to attach training wheels to the bottom of our crosses and carry them around on the bottom so that carrying our cross is made easier. No. This week we're going to have to pick up our crosses, minus the training wheels, and follow in Jesus' footsteps. And yet, for just a few moments, let's bask in this day of victory. Let's get out the ticker tape and celebrate, because you know what? All four gospel writers, as we heard, they allow themselves that luxury. The Palm Sunday account, it's one of the few events in the New Testament that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all record. And yeah, as we heard, details may vary a bit, as they always do when eyewitness accounts are the basis for reporting. In fact, such slight variations actually add credibility to the accounts. In a court of law, a judge or a jury, they use what's called the laws of evidence. So when all of the defense's witnesses give testimony that sounds identical in every minute aspect, then that sort of sounds coached. Yeah, those witnesses have been prepared to put on the best positive spin of the events of the case, to try to present it in its best possible light. But when we hear slight variations, it tends to hold more water, because when a bunch of people all witness the same thing, don't they all tend to see it from a slightly different perspective? Ain't that real life? Yeah, the details may vary slightly, but the major stuff remains intact. And that's what we get to see from our four gospel writers with today's story. So as we visualize this event, I want you to focus, first of all, folks, upon the manner in which Jesus entered Jerusalem. It was the time of the Passover celebration. Jerusalem would have swelled immensely, and being a religious Jew, Jesus would come as well. But in preparation, Jesus did something quite unusual. He instructed his disciples to borrow a young donkey upon which no one had ever ridden, for him to sit upon as he would ride into town. And folks, it's interesting that Jesus and his disciples probably came by foot all the way from Galilee. That would have been a journey of about 75 miles, a several-day journey. But now as he approaches Bethphage and Bethany, two small villages just over the rise on the backside of a hill that overlooks Jerusalem called the Mount of Olives, for the last couple of miles, Jesus decides to ride a donkey. Folks, I've been to the little village of Bethany, the place where Jesus' dear friends Lazarus and Martha and Mary lived. And on Palm Sunday, 33 years ago, at the ripe old age of 21, I walked down the Mount of Olives with the other Palm Sunday worshipers into Jerusalem, waving my palm. And yet, it's a good question. Why ride the last 2 miles on a donkey? What gives? And yeah, obviously, like a lot of things in Jesus' life, we're aware of this fulfillment of prophecy that we heard mentioned from Zechariah 9:9. Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. So without question, sure, we know this whole prophetic bailiwick. At Bethany, he sends 2 of his disciples ahead, and he says to them, go to the village ahead of you, and just as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. And if anyone asks you, why are you doing this? Say, the Lord needs it, and we'll send it back here shortly. Yeah, at the Master's request, the disciples did as they were told, and they retrieved this young colt. But what's the significance of the Messiah riding a donkey? Just this. All of Israel has been waiting for centuries for a Messiah that would be this political revolutionary. Yeah, they expected the Messiah to come riding in on a white charger with his sword drawn, ready to overthrow those those Roman oppressors. And yet somehow they must have missed Zechariah's prophecy. Because let's recall, folks, in the days of Zechariah centuries before, when a king came riding on a horse, he was announcing his intention to declare war on his enemy. However, when a king came riding in on a donkey, he was announcing his intention to make peace with his enemies. Yeah, Jesus' entry into Jerusalem on a donkey was his announcement that he had come to usher in a kingdom of peace. Riding on a donkey was a declaration of his purpose and his mission, not just for the Jews, but for all of humanity. He came in peace, for peace, and to bring peace, a peace that without Christ, this world can never know. Yeah, such a mode of transportation was significant. He wasn't riding on some ornate chariot. He rode upon a young donkey, an insignificant, lowly animal that was generally thought of as a beast of burden. And was it a metaphor? After all, in 5 short days, he himself would take upon his shoulders the burden of the sins of the world. And he would be spat upon and beaten and mocked and jeered and nailed to a cross. And all of that may just be symbolized by this lowly beast of burden upon which he sat, a humble donkey. Because meanwhile, on the other side of town, a guy named Pontius Pilate was entering Jerusalem at about the same time on a Roman war horse, a symbol of power. And could it be that that's why Jesus taught us that those who exalt themselves will be humbled, while those who humble themselves, they shall be exalted? Yeah, Jesus modeled for his disciples the lifestyle that he wanted them to live. He practiced what he preached. So I want us to notice the manner in which Jesus came as we ourselves enter Holy Week. Let's consider for a moment that if Jesus models for us the manner in which he came, then let's ask, how are we to come? And folks, to talk about that, let's draw upon the wisdom of one of my personal heroes of the faith, Martin Luther, About 500 years ago, this leader of the Protestant Reformation, of which we are now a part today, shared, I think, one of the most important and lasting contributions to our faith. He talked about the distinction between what he called the theology of glory and the theology of the cross. And he saw a theology of glory in what he called emphasizing triumphalism without acknowledging suffering first. Triumphalism says, we know, we have all the answers, God is blessing us because we've got it all figured out. And folks, Jesus saw this triumphalism, the waving of palms. It was literally an ancient symbol for victory. It's like a March Madness basketball crowd there at the end of the game, triumphantly singing, na 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 na, na 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 na, hey, goodbye. Yeah! It's sort of trash talking. Booyah! In your face, Romans! The Palm Sunday crowd, they were going all in on this theology of glory stuff. Sure, Jesus saw that 2,000 years ago, as did Luther, 5 centuries ago, as we see it manifested so many times today. Let's take poster boy Joel Osteen. His mega church down there in Houston, Texas. He preaches with all those pearly white teeth and that perfect hair. And he's got those twinkling blue eyes. And he's on TV when you get up getting ready for church in the morning. And he looks and he sounds so good. And he writes bestsellers like Your Best Life Now. 7 steps to living at your full potential. Yes. Folks, the theology of glory is sort of a spiritualized pop psychology that focuses on all the positive aspects of the faith. Heaven, the resurrection, and naming and claiming all the blessings that God is going to shower down on you because you're His special child. But the theology of glory, it only works great until something wrong happens in your life. And once you realize that you're not in heaven yet, and this way of thinking about God comes up kind of short. But over against the theology of glory, Luther contrasted this way of thinking with the theology of the cross. And this way of speaking about God, it doesn't try to say, we've got all the answers. We know. Sort of triumphantly. It doesn't try to sweep some of the mysteries of life under the rug, the big why questions or inconvenient ideas like sin and judgment and death. This is a way to talk about God that acknowledges the very real darkness that exists in the world around us. And perhaps in understanding the difference between these two theologies, an old song written by a guy by the name of Johnny Mercer is helpful. Old Johnny used to sing, you gotta accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative, latch on to the affirmative, and don't mess with who? Mr. In-Between. Yeah, that's a theology of glory. It's nothing more than the power of positive thinking, just 7 easy steps. That's all it takes. Be positive and everything will just work out fine. But that's sort of blind optimism. It doesn't get you very far in a real world because eliminating the negative means eliminating the cross, suffering, death. And if we remove the cross of Christ from our theology, then our suffering becomes senseless. And yet a huge number of Christian people get sucked into this kind of thinking. It's popular, and it's attractive, and it's for winners. But what about all the so-called losers? the poor, and the suffering. Does that mean that God doesn't bless them too? And folks, if a theology is a theology that isn't equally applicable for all people, then is it a theology that can hold water? And if it can't hold water for those living in some shanty town in Africa, or for someone who's poor with no running water down in Pullman, just south of here, then is it really an accurate depiction of our faith? So it's a good question this morning as we begin Holy Week. How did Jesus come? Triumphantly on a white charger, or humbly on a donkey? And if we are His followers, do we put training wheels on the bottom of our crosses, or do we try to eliminate the cross altogether? Not mess with the complexities of living in a real, honest to goodness, faith life world. And if we do, what's the relevance of our faith to those around us who are dealing with life's difficulties? And if Jesus didn't come in this way, then should we? Or as we head into Holy Week, do we face the cross squarely? Do we look it in the eye and we live in the complexity and the ambiguity of its shadow, admitting that we don't have all the answers and everything is not all black and white, and that sometimes we got to live with Mr. In-Between? That's why we recited the Apostles' Creed this morning. No, we do have bedrock, solid things that we believe in the faith. And we confess those this morning. And yet as God's people, gathered at the foot of the cross, we reveal ourselves to be the kind of people who come to the faith honestly and humbly, not arrogantly, so that the world around us might come and ask why. Yeah, first off, we notice the manner in which Jesus came on that Palm Sunday. But secondly, let's notice the reaction of the crowd. Mark notes that Jesus entered Jerusalem, and as He did, many of them put their cloaks down on the road, while others spread their palm branches from the fields. And it seems that, victorious kings were honored in this way back then. So apparently, many of the crowd welcomed Him as a king. But of course, there were also cynics in the crowd, just as there are today. A donkey, peasants throwing down branches. And yet this kind of adulation, it reminds us, folks, of the fickleness of human nature and how often we straddle the fence, because don't we know that in just a few days that those who were shouting, Hosannas, they will be shouting for Jesus to be crucified. No, just as for us today, not everyone who sings loud praises to Jesus can be counted on when the going gets tough. Because in a few days, when it comes down to choosing Jesus or Barabbas, many will forget that they even knew Him, including those who were closest to Him. So we'll have to ask ourselves this week, could that be us? Could we be like those who just sort of followed the crowd? One writer says, when folks are free to do as they please, they usually tend to imitate each other. Take the guy who was in Utah, and he put this whole follow the crowd phenomenon to the test. The store that he owned, it wasn't doing too well, even though it was on a main drag. So one day he got this bright idea, and he bought several used cars, and he just sort of parked them out front of his business. And sure enough, all kinds of folks started showing up and buying his stuff. And why? Because they assumed that all those cars out front meant that this must be a happening place. And folks, that same thing is true of churches. Some folks are attracted to churches because their friends go there, or family expects it, or because of all the cars parked out front. And true, some earnestly seek God for their life. But whatever the reason, if I were to ask you today why you are here, what would you answer? In Matthew 16, Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And folks, Jesus didn't want Peter and his homeboys to believe that he was God's son just because he said so. He wanted them to kick the tires and check under the hood and see for themselves. So if you are visiting with us today for the first time, or as I know, some have been visiting with us for a while, and you are still uncertain about who this Jesus is, then hopefully this is a great place to check him out. Yeah, the crowds on that first Palm Sunday walked beside the donkey. And today, we can do the same. Check under the tail and give the hooves a good kick and see for yourselves. And then check us out. See if we are the real deal, a loving and caring, giving and serving community. And no, we haven't arrived yet. We're still under construction. We don't pretend to have all the answers, but we are, as fellow sinners and seekers, trying to gather at the foot of the cross, earnestly and humbly. And then each week we scatter to serve. And if that's attractive to you, then climb on the donkey and join us. And for those of you who've been here for a long time, I ask again, how are we coming? Are we coming with humility and peace to our community? And as we go out from here, how is the community reacting to us? Do we pass the sniff test? Or do we start to smell a little bit like a pile of donkey dung? It's a good question. That brings us to one last thing, folks. What does Palm Sunday mean for us? You remember back when the Beatles were big and when they claimed that they were more popular than Jesus? They weren't singing about "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." But now at the age of 70, one of the Beatles, named Ringo Starr, he's left behind the drugs and the alcohol. He's gone cold turkey. And he says that God now plays a huge role in his life. And recently he says, I stepped off the path there for a while. But I thank God that I found my way back. And folks, this book, it reminds us of the fact that there will come a day when every knee will bow to this humble King who rides into our lives today on a donkey. And Palm Sunday, it prefigures that day which is to come. So as we think about Palm Sunday and what it means to us, I hope in the most important place of all, that you'll be throwing Jesus a ticker tape parade. Not in New York City, not in Jerusalem, but right here in your heart. Because if he isn't the king there, then all the hooting and hollering and hosannas and hallelujahs in the world, they aren't worth a pile of donkey dung. And now may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord look upon you with favor and give you peace. Amen.